Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. This afternoon's panel, I promise, will be a treat. My name is Devin Carbado again, and I am a professor of law at UCLA, and I am still black after this earlier conversation. And I just want to say one quick thing about that. Sometimes the invocation of blackness is understood to reflect a kind of simplicity around racial categorization. And I really would want to contest that. As our earlier panel discussed, blackness is an ethnic identity, people have different relationship to it, it's intersectional, etc. So that very articulation begs the question, it seems to me, as to why, how, and what that might mean in any given context, rather than a category that is fixed across time, space, and content. At any rate, my project today is rather simple. It is to introduce Professor Angela Riley, and it is a treat to do so. She's a professor of law at UCLA and the director of the American Indian Studies and the joint degree program, the MA-JD program in Law and American Indian Studies. We were thrilled several years ago at the possibility of luring Professor Riley to UCLA, and even more thrilled when she decided to join our community. She's a terrific scholar, a terrific teacher, and a terrific institutional citizenship. Her work focuses on indigenous people's rights and its intersection with cultural property. Her work appears in just about every fancy law review you can imagine, including Yale, California Law Review, Columbia, Georgetown, etc. In 2003, she was elected to the Supreme Court of her nation, becoming the first woman and I believe the youngest person to be so appointed. And in 2010, she became the Chief Justice of her nation's Supreme Court. And speaking of Supreme Court, a few weeks ago, she delivered a lecture to the United States Supreme Court on indigeneity, Native Americans, and the law, and I think that speaks well to the breadth and depth of her knowledge. She was recently appointed to serve on the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Partnership Policy Board, which again speaks to her standing in this field. I can think of no better person to help us think about the fraught role that law plays managing questions of diversity across a number of different legal domains. Please join me in welcoming Professor Angela Riley.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Devin, for that wonderful introduction. Very gracious, and I want to thank Devin for all the work that he's done putting this conference together and also putting this particular panel together. Before I start, I'm going to follow in the good path of my friend and colleague, Professor Mashana Goman, if she's still here. Thank you, Mashana, for your leadership, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the region whose land we are on today. So first off, I just want to extend a special thanks, I think the person who has not really been acknowledged so far, to Vice Provost Belinda Tucker, who has worked tirelessly on this conference and has provided invaluable institutional and intellectual guidance to us all in this and numerous other endeavors that we're working on. So I thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to be moderating this plenary. As Steve Aaron noted last night, if you were here, he stated that it's fitting that we commence this launch with a plenary of historians so that we're sure to mark the past several hundred years of California history that serves as a critical foundation for the discussions that we're engaging in today. So if historical antecedents provide the proper jumping off point for this dialogue, I like to think that law, coming as the third of 5 panels of the day, serves as the zenith of this gathering. But I will leave this to you to decide. I'm a lawyer, so it's worth pausing here just for a moment to make one acknowledgement, and that is that as some of you in the room know, but likely many of you do not, just yesterday, the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, a bill that includes provisions, numerous provisions to protect women in the United States, but includes specifically provisions for tribal prosecution of non-Indian perpetrators of domestic violence against Indian women in Indian country, a pretty radical departure from the last several decades of law governing Indian country, passed the House by a vote of 286 to 138, and so now it's on its way to the President for signature. So as a lawyer, of course, I'm going to give, yes, absolutely. So as a lawyer, I'm going to give myself away as a believer in the law and in what I see as hopefully the long arc of justice. So now onto our plenary, Righting Civil Wrongs in the Context of Superdiversity, the Possibilities and Limitations of Law. I will borrow a bit from my colleague, Devin Carbato, in describing a little bit about this panel and then describing briefly what the panelists will discuss before I turn it over to them. So laws played a significant role in effectuating social change in American society. Certainly we see this in regards to racial progress. It's not to say that laws standing alone perform this work. Even some of the most revolutionary cases, Brown v. Board of Education and others, can't really be understood in legal terms alone. They must be understood as part of a larger social movement. But this observation raises a crucial question for the emerging superdiverse United States that this conference seeks to illuminate. What clear legal visions, at a minimum, do we need to address the complex social problems that superdiversity presents? So we've asked our panelists today to consider both the means and the ends of civil rights, and consider in particular, in the age of superdiversity, is civil rights advocacy outdated altogether? Or in the case of indigenous peoples who never fully embraced civil rights at all, what does superdiversity mean for indigenous nationhood in light of massive local and global demographic changes in indigenous populations? So this plenary will explore these questions across a number of disparate legal areas, from the intersection of law and science, to affirmative action, to sovereignty and governance, to immigration law. The panelists will address the possibilities and limitations of law that our emerging America presents. So with that, please let me introduce our esteemed panelists in the order in which they will speak. First, Professor Jerry Kong is a professor of law at UCLA School of Law and UCLA Asian American Studies. He's also the Korea Times Hankook Ilbo Chair in Korean American Studies and Law. Professor Kong has written extensively in areas of race and communications, and his talk today will focus on his research concerning the nexus between implicit bias and the law, with the goal of advancing a behavioral realism that imports new scientific findings from the mind sciences into law. Professor Kong received his JD and AB from Harvard. Next, we have Elise Bodie, who's an associate professor of law at New York Law School and acting director of litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She's litigated numerous cases at the trial and appellate level involving affirmative action in higher education, employment, school desegregation, and economic justice. Her writings, including her article Racial Territoriality, have received wide acclaim. Today, she'll speak about issues surrounding affirmative action with an emphasis on intra-group diversity and critical mass. Professor Bodie received her JD and MPP from Harvard and her BA from Yale. Next, we have Addie Rolnick, who's an associate professor at William S. Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she teaches federal Indian law, critical race theory, and criminal law. Prior to joining the UNLV faculty, she was the inaugural Critical Race Studies Fellow at UCLA School of Law, where she organized an amazing, involving many people in this room, interdisciplinary symposium on the relationship between race and sovereignty. Her article, The Promise of Mankari, Indian Political Rights as Racial Remedy, broke new ground in connecting up conceptions of sovereignty, race, and indigeneity. Her talk today will build off of those ideas as she discusses the anomalous position of American Indians in the superdiverse America and how, if at all, they fit within the larger racial justice movement. Professor Rolnick received her JD and MA from UCLA and her BA from Oberlin College. And finally, but certainly not least, Bill Ong Hing is professor of law at University of San Francisco School of Law. Professor Hing is an expert in Asian Americans and the law, immigration policy, public interest lawyering, and race relations. He's the author of numerous academic and practice-oriented publications on immigration policy and race relations. His book, To Be an American, Cultural Pluralism and the Rhetoric of Assimilation, received numerous awards. He's the founder of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco and continues to volunteer as general counsel for that organization. His talk today will build off of his long and prestigious career as an expert on immigration and race relations and explore increasing challenges posed by enforcement of immigration law at multi-governmental levels. Professor Hing received his JD from the University of San Francisco and his bachelor's from Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thanks, Anne. Angela. On a warm, almost sunny day after lunch, it's a hard task to talk about the possibility and limits of law, but let's just run with it. The frame, possibilities and limits of law, and we are focusing on law. We are lawyers in some sense, but I want to emphasize what we teach our students, that law only works in conjunction with facts, right? Law cannot function without facts. Law is applied to facts. The problem with race today, basically, is that the facts are underlying, the most important facts that are underlying the conversations about race and racial justice are simply contested. So I think this is right, and the political scientists could tell me in some sense. I think most people think that we already live in what I call a colorblind tournament of merit. In a modern, capitalistic, hyper-competitive, globalized world, we're okay with it being a tournament, like a tournament to the death, a Hunger Games style, right? We understand there must be winners and losers. We always think we're going to be the winners. We love the whole lift yourself up by the bootstraps kind of idea, mano to mano, kill the weak, all that stuff. We will accept some mild forms of tax and transfer, but the truth be told, it's like, you know, let's do it, bring it. That is the American ethic, and that is how we view the competition that is life, economic, and otherwise. So if you think that that's the case, and you also buy the message from 1963 when MLK says, judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, then you embrace a certain kind of colorblindness. And if you think we already live in a colorblind tournament of merit, then what do you think about the actual results? Well, look, if the actual results have some people on top and some people on bottom, hey, I'm not going to say it publicly, but it must be because the people on bottom deserve their status. They're just not good enough. They didn't hustle. I don't know if it's genetic, I don't know if it's cultural, I'm not going to say it. But if they're at the bottom, there's a reason for it. Slavery ended a long time ago, exclusion ended a long time ago. I don't really know any history because I'm an American, but I know it ended a long time ago. Right? I don't want to read that stuff. And the idea is, if you believe this is so, there's implications on how we respond to disparity. If you think people have lost because they deserve to lose, it's like I could do some mild tax transfer. I ain't gonna give up. I'm not gonna give up my kid's seat to the university when they're all competing in the Hunger Games. So the underlying facts are what's really contested, not only conceptions of equality. And the question then becomes, how do you resolve underlying questions of fact? So now we're going to convert to science, which is kind of odd in some ways, and there's lots of reasons why people who do race work also are skeptical about how science has been used, right? So Michael Omi has talked about the rise of a certain kind of a biologically informed conception of race that seems at odds with our embrace of social constructionism. But let me share with you a little bit of science that comes principally from experimental social psychology. And given limited time, I'm just going to give you a sampler of both implicit biases as well as stereotypes. Many of you will be familiar with these, but I think they create a vice that sticks people in a particular kind of way. And my claim is, if you can persuade people through science, which, whether you like it or not, is the gold standard by which we resolve contested questions of fact. Like when you decide to give meds or not to your kid, you think, well, was there a double-blind FDA-sponsored kind of study before I give the kid the medicine, yes or no? Notwithstanding what you might have taught in your, Society and Technology Studies class that afternoon, you want to know whether that's actually been passed by the FDA in a particular kind of way. So let me introduce you to a lot of work that I've been doing on implicit bias. And I'm going to start with where you sit, right? So it turns out our brains operate through schema. Schemas is just a fancy way to say that they're templates of knowledge. So when you sat down, you didn't worry too much about it. Anything with a flat bottom and a back for things, or stool like wheels, it doesn't really matter. Unless you're going antiquing or you're worried about the chair not being able to hold your weight, you know what it is, you chunk it, you sit down on it. But it turns out, the reasons why we need to do that is because there's too much information hitting our senses at any given time. So we have to always chunk the world that we see, right, into objects or categories. What's interesting is that people are not exceptional. We do this with human beings as well. And so when people say, like when you see me, right, so I'm the smiley face, you immediately use mapping rules that society has given to you to put me into various categories. So let's focus on race, although you did this with gender and profession and other things. So it's just visually spotting me, looking at my last name, you know to put me into a particular racial category called Asian American. You might say Asian, not in this crowd, but in other crowds, especially if you're older, you might say Oriental. If you're thinking ethnic, you might be, maybe he's Korean, maybe he's Chinese. That's not a Japanese name. He's certainly not Asian Indian and not Filipino. But you put me into a particular category almost automatically. And when you do so, the idea is By putting me into that category, there's a set of meanings that activate. By meanings, I mean attitudes as well as stereotypes, which alter your interaction with me almost automatically, right? So you put me into a category, immediately it changes the way you respond to me. How do we know that it's automatic? I can give you lots of evidence. I think John Bunche has done some great stuff where, this is a great example, where he brings in a bunch of undergrads, they gotta make lunch money. He tells them, count the number of circles on a computer screen. Are they even or odd? This is a very mundane task. After the 130th iteration, the computer is designed to crash. Someone in the lab code rushes in and says, oh, it crashed, you're gonna have to do it all over again. Obviously, the students are gonna be pissed. How upset are they going to be? What they also don't know is that between each counting task, they were flashed subliminally a prime of either an African-American male face or a white male face. And what they also don't know is that there were video cameras trained on them to record their reaction. On a scale of 1 through 10, 1 being not angry, 10 being very angry, if they were subliminally flashed a white face, subliminal means they don't recognize that any picture was flashed whatsoever, they score a 2.13. A black face, 2.79. So even when you can't see race, i.e. you're colorblind, there's no face to be seen because it's subliminal, there still was an activation of a set of meanings associated with black male hostility and fear, such that you saw a palpably different reaction in terms of anger. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests, again, that we chunk people immediately. Like, think about gender. Like, if you're heterosexual and you're at a bar, you're immediately sorting, and you're single, you're immediately sorting by opposites. You're doing all kinds of work in your brain without even admitting it. Same thing happens with race. So the goal is to try to figure out what kind of baggage you have about particular categories, right? So what kind of meanings do you have about, say, an Asian American male? Because if you have attitudes and stereotypes that are biased, then your reaction to me will be biased, and we will not be competing in a colorblind tournament of merit. So why not just ask people what attitudes and stereotypes people have? You run into at least two problems. One is, the truth is, even if people have explicit biases, like stuff they know about and they'll endorse and they'll say very, very privately, they don't want to be hit with like a hammer of the PC police. Like, oh man. Like, you sidle up to someone, you ask, so what do you really think about women? Are they really as good at math as men? What do you think about those Asians? They're really good technically, right? But have you ever heard a really good Asian speaker? Really good? I'm not sure. Really? Really? I don't know. So maybe after the 7th beer, they'll say what they really think. But before the first, they aren't going to say anything. Like, yeah, I don't know. You're gonna blog this. No, I think MLK. And so people are not going to say what they think. This is what political scientists have struggled with for a long time by asking indirect questions. More disturbing is the possibility that maybe they're not able. This is the essence of implicit bias. I know it's a long wind-up, but it's a really interesting idea. What if you got junk in your heads that you're not even aware of? It's like living in LA, you all have, if you live in LA, you have a lot of nasty, nasty particulate matter, less than 2.5 nanometers, embedded in your alveoli, in your lungs. Because you live in LA, you breathe in the fresh air, right? It's not your fault, really, but you got junk in your lungs. The same thing happened with our heads. And so a great psychologist, Edward Clapperade, wrote this great paper published around the 1920s where he talked about a patient that suffered from Korsakoff syndrome. And this person, because of damage to parts of her brain, could not form new memories. So every time he would treat her, the next day she would say, oh, nice to meet you. And he would introduce himself, treat her that day, come back the next day, oh, nice to meet you. She couldn't remember who this doctor was. So one day he deviously hides a little pin in his hand and shakes her hand. She's startled because the pin hurts. The next day he comes in and she says, oh, nice to meet you. He reaches out his hand to shake hers. She politely declines to shake his hand. He says, why won't you shake my hand? He says, well, isn't it my right not to shake someone's hand? Maybe something could be hidden. So even though she could not explicitly recall the memory that happened the day earlier, she still had almost an imprint from the experience left in her brain that altered her behavior. And it's that intuition of things implicit that could change behavior that drives a whole bunch of research in the mind sciences, including this stuff. Okay, given limited time, let's see what I can do. Look, so if I'm trying to find the junk in your heads, right, that's the goal, right? What are your attitudes? Do you like me or dislike me? Do you think, like, when you see me, do you have stereotypes about me? More likely than not that he, got a perfect score on his math SAT. More likely than not that he's a martial artist. More likely than not that he can't parallel park on Wilshire. More likely than not, you know the drill. I can say this. I have tenure. You don't ask people, can you measure? And what scientists have done is to use different things, including putting people under magnets, the fMRI, and other kinds of stuff. But it turns out the most useful way to measure people turns out to be, it's crazy, kind of have people play video games and measure the speed of your reaction. How many people have taken an implicit association test? So actually not that many people. So I'm going to go through it quickly, mindful again about time, and see what I can do. It's all about the need for speed. You sit in front of a computer and this is what happens. You're given either faces, white or black, and we know, even though they're propped this way, who's white, who's black. If you see a white face, hit a key with their left hand. If you see a black face, hit a key with your right hand. But you're also shown words that could be good words like joy, love, laughter, happy. If you see good words, hit a key with your left hand. Sometimes you're shown bad words. Bad words could mean words such as, agony, evil, awful, failure. Hit a key with your right hand. Notice how on the left hand are white faces and good words. On the right hand are black faces and bad words. That's what we call a schema-consistent pairing. We fly through that test. But scientists are devious, and they give you runs that look like this, where white and bad are on the same response, and black and good are on the same response key. And we slightly stutter and go more slowly and make more errors. And the implicit association effect is, by definition, whatever time delta there is between, say, pairing white and good and black and good faces. So you find out that it's maybe 0.2 of a second, 200 milliseconds, and you just call that the IIT effect, run some stats on it to create standardized units. And what you find out is that when you give people these tests, you get overwhelming evidence that implicit bias, at least as measured by this stupid video game, who knows, maybe it means nothing, is incredibly pervasive. So most people have biases. I'll show you a little bit more. In a very early study by Cunningham and Bunche out at Harvard, it's about 180 students out in the Northeast, it turns out that the students could sort white faces, 83% of them could sort white faces with good words faster than black faces. 86% rich over poor, 79% American over foreign, 77% Christian over Jewish, 78% straight over gay. And if you always think it breaks 3-to-1, 2-to-1, one way or the other, it turns out 51-49 birds over trees. And I can show you all kinds of evidence that comes from much larger data sets, like Project Implicit, that includes millions of people, and you find out 80% of the people who take this test show a preference of young over old, 68 white over black, 68 straight over gay, 69 thin over fat, 72 associate weapons with black male faces more than white male faces. So there is a non-random distribution of scores that I can tell you a lot more about, and what it suggests interestingly is that we might have stuff in our heads that if we knew about, we would explicitly reject, but nonetheless, there's evidence that it actually exists. What's interesting further is that no one is immune. If you think like, hey, I'm with the CRS faculty, I do the fist bump thing, like I participate in no, there's no way turns out, not really. Whatever you have, you should just assume, starting, if you know nothing else, you should assume that you have the junk of what you think other people have. Right? That's the best way to gauge what you're likely to have. I know you're not biased, but what do you think other people think? And then you'll say, oh yeah, they think all this crap. That's probably what you have. And at this point, I just want to emphasize, I guess I'll just talk about why it matters to give you some payoff. So all that I've shown to you is that scientists have looked at implicit biases, found ways to measure it through reaction times. If you're impatient, you want to say, okay, who cares if someone's a little bit better on a video game? Show me the money. I'll show you one example of a study that I did here at UCLA with Bunche Dasgupta, who's a psychologist at UMass Amherst. We took in a lot of people from the West Side, really, people who live around us. We asked them, really, when you think litigator, what are you thinking? So we brought them in, we asked them all kinds of surveys. What do you think about the average white litigator? What do you think about the average Asian litigator? There's no bias. But we also created a test to measure their implicit biases. We flashed them pictures of white people, Asian people, had litigator words, scientist words, and measured how quickly they could play this sorting game. Then we had them put on headphones and listen to and watch the text of 2 depositions of comparable quality that were not even about race. It was like slip and fall and an auto accident. And we asked them questions. How good was this lawyer? Right? On competence and other kinds of stuff. Here's what we find, right? Some of them did have explicit stereotypes, thinking that Asians were worse than whites. And it turns out, if you're willing to say that on a survey, like in a political science sense, then they actually explicitly downgraded the Asian attorney, and they weren't shy to do so. But what's really interesting is there are a bunch of people who would show no such explicit surveys, and what we found nonetheless was that they showed in-group favoritism. If on this crazy little test, you thought and you were more quickly associating the white face than the Asian face with the litigator, then you ended up evaluating the white attorney that much more. What you should know is that these depositions were the exact same depositions, recorded with the exact same voice. And all that we did was flash a picture of a white male attorney or an Asian male attorney for 5 seconds right before and included their last name on the transcript. So it's an audit study. It's the exact same deposition with the exact same audio. All that we did was flash for 5 seconds a picture of a face, and you had materially different results as a function of implicit biases that these good people from West LA would reject. I've run out of time in some sense, so I just want to close up, and I can come back to it in other kinds of ways. One study doesn't mean anything. Coffee's good for you, coffee's bad for you, wine is good for you. Yeah. So good scientists run meta-analyses, and if you actually run the whole meta-analyses, I think it's fair to say that the best evidence suggests that up to almost 6% of the variation in lots of intergroup behavioral relationships, whether it's body language, evaluations, other kinds of stuff, can be actually explained by implicit biases, even controlling for explicit reports on surveys. Why is all this important? And I know I'm going over, so I'm going to really finish. All that I'm going to suggest is when you have evidence from the sciences that suggests that we're not nearly as colorblind as we think we are, the law can be held to account. I've done a lot of work on how the law should be held to account, and I'm just going to put out a structure that might be useful for conversation throughout. We like grids. Devin and I both like grids, and here's the idea. And then I will stop. The idea is that oftentimes you can get interesting knowledge from just doing 2x2s, right? So on the horizontal axis is time orientation. Are you talking about after the fact, which is ex post, we like Latin, or before, which is ex ante? And then the knowledge of the bias, right? Because scientific findings are probabilistic by nature. It won't tell you what specific individual is going to get cancer or what specific individual is actually going to get some sort of disease. So it's either specific or general information. And what I wanted to convey, I think more than anything else, is that a lot of people immediately jump to this prejudice polygraph. Are you saying you're going to force me to take some test, and then because I fail some stupid video game test, you're going to call me racist and make me pay up? No way, right? I think that is a red herring. No one is suggesting that in an ex post context, after some act of discrimination is being litigated, specifically about some individual, that we will actually put them under some machine, take a test, and call them racist and therefore liable under Title VII. It turns out that there's lots of other ways to think about this, including more generalized information that might be relevant after the fact in, say, affirmative action litigation. I know that Elise is going to be talking about affirmative action, so I'll actually point that off. I'm being told I need to stop. As well as some prevention, which is interesting because there might be ways to train people to avoid some of the biased behavior once they learn about implicit biases. I've gone too far. Thank you for your attention.
So good afternoon. So I'm not only on a panel at 1 after lunch, but I have to go after Jerry Kong. So my task is all the more challenging. So I confess that I'm standing here having a lot of cognitive dissonance. Angela mentioned that I'm the litigation director for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I'm actually on leave from teaching, and so I have sort of one foot in academia and sort of the possibilities of law, like, you know, creative thinking about how to use the law to advance social opportunity, which is where a lot of my work concentrates itself. And then I'm in this sort of, right now, somewhat narrow role where I'm trying to defend the doctrine and in this through this very, very narrow prism. And just 2 days ago, I was at the Supreme Court for the argument in the Voting Rights Act case. This is a challenge to a core provision of the Voting Rights Act, which essentially requires certain areas of the country that have a bad history of discrimination and continuing history of discrimination to clear any voting changes with the Department of Justice or a 3-judge panel in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who might know anything about constitutional law or the Civil War, you can imagine that for the states' rights folks, this makes them crazy, this provision. And it's been challenged 4 times before the Supreme Court, upheld each time. And we're now on our 5th challenge, actually 6th challenge. There was an earlier case that ducked the constitutional issue. And we represent clients in Shelby County, Alabama, which is bringing this challenge. And these are African-American clergy and 1 council member who have suffered discrimination on the ground, know the realities of discrimination, and want this core provision protected. It may not surprise any of you here that the justices are highly skeptical of this provision, and it was widely reported that Justice Scalia, in particular, analogized, actually he didn't analogize, he just said it straight out. He said, this act is a racial entitlement. So this act that actually prevents discrimination from taking root, that guards against discrimination, is an act of racial entitlement. Now, I know I'm being taped, so I have to be careful about what I say about Justice Scalia. But that type of comment, and again, some of the tenor of the questioning, reveals that the court has a very deep skepticism of any measures that explicitly rely on race. And what folks who don't litigate, they tend to be a little bit frustrated with LDF, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because they say, why are you all so focused on the Supreme Court? Why are you in the Supreme Court? Who cares about the Supreme Court? Right? That doctrine is old, it's outdated. Why are you even there? And the fact of the matter is that we don't actually want to be there, but we have to be there in order to defend this core doctrine, right, and to protect the opportunities that we have. But I wanted to start there with the observations about the justices' questioning, the tone of their questioning, because it illustrates a central challenge for civil rights lawyers. And I think the title of this panel, right, the possibilities and limitations of law, says it all, right? Because once again, the possibilities of law, constitutional doctrine, are somewhat narrow. And so as civil rights lawyers, how do you create spaces and opportunities for the inclusion of people of color, right, within this somewhat narrow constitutional prism? Constitutional law, and I am focusing very explicitly on constitutional law, is largely at war. And maybe largely, so that's my optimistic civil rights lawyer frame. My academic frame would just say, yeah, it's at war with notions of substantive racial equality and inclusion and opportunity. All right, so that's the frame for my remarks, and that brings me back to the question that I wanted to explore with you today about what I call diversity within diversity. And I'm looking through a fairly narrow doctrinal prism. And what I'm interested in is sort of given that the Supreme Court has recognized the compelling educational benefits of diversity in higher education, how can doctrine accommodate diversity within racial groups? How can it accommodate diversity within racial groups? And this takes me to a very sort of individualized, individualistic, and somewhat instrumental frame, more than I'm actually comfortable with, but again, sort of working through the doctrine, how much can we achieve? So the idea of diversity within diversity is not just the idea that we have diversity among underrepresented racial groups, but also that we have diversity within underrepresented minority groups. And I appreciated Professor Carbato's opening because that sort of sets the stage for this question, right? How does law manage racial identity, or does it manage racial identity at all? And so to explore this point, I want to use another case that is currently pending in the Supreme Court, which is Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin. And in lay terms, we might say that this is an affirmative action case. I actually use affirmative action as a shorthand because people instinctively know what that is, or they think they know what it is. It means that you're using race in some manner in the context of, at least in higher education, an admissions plan. But as it turns out, affirmative action isn't really appropriate or accurate terminology doctrinally, because to the extent that we think about it as a means, a race-conscious means for promoting opportunity for underrepresented people of color, that it's not, Fisher is not really an affirmative action case. It's a case about the constitutionality and role of racial diversity in higher education. And so why am I drawing that distinction between diversity and affirmative action? And the distinction has to do with, again, a very narrow view, and I cannot emphasize this enough, that the Supreme Court has adopted about when considerations of race are constitutionally permissible. And we can trace this back to a 1978 case, a seminal case, right out of the UC system, Bakke versus University of California, Davis Medical School. And there the court said that universities cannot consider the race of individual candidates to promote affirmative action, right? That is, that they can't use race in an individualized way to promote, for the purpose of promoting opportunity and making the country more inclusive, given the long-standing history of discrimination and racial disadvantage in this country. Right, so sadly, it's unclear the extent to which you could address problems of implicit bias, for example, within this framework. So you can't use race in that way to promote opportunity, but you can use race, Bakke said, as one of many different factors in higher education admissions in order to pursue the educational benefits associated with having a diverse student body. And that's a mouthful, but all of those component parts really matter, right? Diversity in higher education, race is one of many different factors. And so what Bakke emphasized is that the purpose of a race-conscious program, right, matters for constitutional purposes. If you don't pursue the right purpose, you lose. But separately, it also matters how the university uses race in admissions. Again, it has to be one of many different factors. You can't have quotas. You can't have a two-track system where minority students are evaluated in one pool and white students are evaluated in another pool. That was clearly articulated by Bakke. All right, so fast forward to 2003. We have a case called Grutter versus Bollinger, where the court reaffirms this principle that the limited consideration of race to advance diversity, the educational benefits of diversity, is constitutionally permitted. It does all kinds of great things, right? It enables cross-racial interaction and understanding. It helps to defeat racial stereotypes. of the kind that we see in the implicit bias work, and it prepares people to live and work in a diverse society. And it's a terrific opinion, an opinion by former Justice O'Connor. But Grutter also introduced another concept, and this is the concept of critical mass. And critical mass is essentially an anti-tokenism principle, right? That is to say that if you want to realize the educational benefits of diversity, you can't do it if you have just a few minorities sprinkled throughout the campus. You have to have meaningful numbers in order to realize the cross-racial interactions and all the great stuff that you get from having diversity on campus. And again, there's a certain common sense to this, right? That you need meaningful numbers in order to achieve the benefits. The problem is that the court didn't actually define what it meant by critical mass, right? It essentially left this up to the universities themselves to define in light of the unique circumstances and demographics of their campuses. All right, so that brings us back to Fisher. Fisher is a case that comes out of the University of Texas. I used to say to my constitutional law students that, Texas is always Texas, right? All the good constitutional law cases, it's all the good, the really interesting ones come out of Texas. And the question that the court is grappling with essentially is, when has the university achieved critical mass? In other words, when has it crossed the diversity threshold such that additional considerations of race are no longer constitutionally permissible? And what makes, I'm talking really fast because they told me I had 5 minutes, so I'm trying to cram this in, but what makes Texas somewhat unique is that it has a percentage plan for university admissions, and I know this is the concept of percentage plans is familiar to those of you in the UC system. And the percentage plan essentially requires UT Austin, which is the flagship university in the state, to admit all public high school students who graduate in the top 10% of their class. And this was just a footnote. This particular law was a footnote to a 1996 case called Hopwood, which essentially outlawed the use of race in Texas in higher education admissions. It was before Grutter. And the Texas state legislature passed this law, and it was able to achieve a certain measure of diversity on the UT campus because why? Because Texas is very residentially segregated, right? So it works. You are able to achieve some measure of diversity on the UT campus because you have a lot of residential segregation throughout the state. So to the extent that you're taking the top 10% of high school students, you're taking students from racially segregated and isolated schools. So at UT Austin, about 75% of the total class is admitted under the top 10 percentage plan. The remaining portion of the class, and this is the critical point for doctrinally, is admitted under what is called holistic review. And this process tracks almost to the T, probably actually even more so than the plans that were upheld in Bakke and Grutter. Race is one of many different factors that is used to evaluate individual applicants. And importantly, many minority students who are admitted during this holistic review are students who have attended maybe integrated high schools, but they're not in the top 10% of their class. They may be in the second decile of their class. They may be the second generation in their family to go to college rather than the first. And so the idea being that minority students who are admitted during this process have a materially different experience than students who are admitted under the 10% plan. And so again, the constitutional question here is the fact that the university seeks to admit minority students from different backgrounds in order to achieve critical mass constitutional? And there was a very awkward exchange between the counsel for the University of Texas about this issue, and I was in the court, and we had kind of encouraged the university to make this argument, and so it was sort of a little awkward to watch. But so the university council is saying that students who are admitted under the top 10% plan tend to come from segregated, minority-identified school, and Justice Alito says, and I love this. He says, well, I thought the whole purpose of affirmative action was to help students from underprivileged backgrounds. But you make a very different argument that I don't think I've ever seen, that the top 10% plan is faulty because it doesn't admit African Americans and Hispanics who come from privileged backgrounds. And University Council replies, and I have a little note to myself to say, that's not true, right? I just told you all that, right? It's not about affirmative action and, that's not about it at all. So the University Council says, no, the point is that we want minorities from different backgrounds, right? And you can sort of see this. If the idea is to help defeat stereotypes, right, you want to see that people come from all different kinds of experiences, right? And so Justice Kennedy says in response, so what you're saying is that what counts is race above all. You want, and University Council says, no, Your Honor, what counts is different experiences. And Justice Kennedy says, you want underprivileged of a certain race and privileged of a certain race. So that's race. And, and I was sitting there and I was just banging I wasn't really, but I was thinking to myself, oh my God, this is not at all what is going on. And so again, the idea is that if you want to seek students who have different racial backgrounds, but also students who have different experiences in light of those backgrounds, right? If you have a Latino student who attends a predominantly white suburban school, that student may have a materially different experience and perspective than a Latino student who attends a majority Latino high school. And by the way, this is fully consistent with the court's doctrine in this area, right? There are cases, in fact, an opinion by Justice Kennedy himself, where he says that in the Texas, what was fatally constitutional about a Texas redistricting plan was that they sort of, glommed all Latinos together because they assumed that Latinos would all be treated the same, right? The court struck down a voluntary integration plan because in another context, because the plan didn't sufficiently take into account differences among people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So the idea here is that the court has said that racial minorities are not fungible. And that's what the University of Texas has tried to do. So I'm going to end there, but essentially, my point is that to the extent that the court is skeptical of race and is skeptical of expanding programs that acknowledge diversity within and among minority communities, it's not clear how far law can be used to expand opportunity and to acknowledge the realities of the superdiversity, right, which are the themes of this conference. So we'll see what happens in the University of Texas. I may have a hooray, depending on what the court does, or I may be very unhappy, but I'll leave it at that. All right, thank you.
So thank you, Devin and Angela and the rest of the organizers for inviting me. I don't know if you can understand how much fun it is to talk about race at UCLA again. I teach in Nevada now, and at UNLV we barely have any kind of ethnic studies programs and classes. We certainly don't have Indian studies at all, and I'm living in a very different environment, so it's really nice to come have these conversations here again. We're talking about the possibilities and the limits of law as a tool for protecting the rights and advancing the interests of minority communities, and I'm very grateful to the previous two panelists for sticking basically within the doctrine that's available, because now I get to do what I think is more fun, which is ask you to leave all of that behind and imagine something different. And I want to do this by focusing on federal Indian law and to think about some of the lessons that Indian law can offer for thinking more broadly about what law can do and maybe what it can't do. In talking about Indian law, I'll focus on two core ideas. One is that Indian law protects group rights. And two is that the legal protections offered by Indian law have an explicitly anti-assimilationist goal. And I'll tell you why those matter. But let me back up and tell you why I think it's important to talk about Indian law in the first place. So one question our panel was asked to consider was how superdiversity might complicate civil rights law. And we can think of superdiversity in a lot of ways. We talked on the phone about what in the world does that term mean. And I've come up with two operating definitions. They're not the only ones, but we can think of it as referring to, first, increasing diversity between groups, so more physical and cultural mixing between groups so that the old racial group lines might matter less in the future. And we can think of it as diversity within groups, so we can talk about greater recognition of individual differences among group members today, which again make the old group identity perhaps less salient than it was before. So adopting these definitions, I'd suggest that superdiversity actually doesn't complicate civil rights law at all. And this is because civil rights law, particularly those protections rooted in the Constitution, has been interpreted according to a particular narrative. And it's a narrative in which the rights of individuals have legal significance, but the rights of groups do not. And it's a narrative in which the ultimate goal is that restrictive racial lines around groups, the old racial groups, will continue to erode until racial difference becomes no more significant than eye color difference. So it doesn't matter at all. If we see it like we see eye color. And the end of this story, it might be an end in which we become a nation that is so mixed that race as we know it ceases to exist at all. Or it might be one where race as we know it maybe continues to exist, but it will be nothing more than a cosmetic difference. People might even be able to don and remove racial identities like colored contact lenses. And this vision of race is particularly apparent in cases considering legality of race-conscious remedies or race-conscious programs designed to advance minority interests. Most of these come under the 14th and 15th Amendments. And I apologize for reading quotes to you, but the best way to demonstrate this is by reading you some quotes from some decisions. So in 1993, in Shaw versus Reno, which is a voting rights case about redistricting, Justice O'Connor explained why race-conscious redistricting was repugnant to the court's vision of a racial future. She said, a reapportionment plan that includes in one district individuals who belong to the same race, but who are otherwise widely separated by geographical and political boundaries, and who may have little in common with one another but the color of their skin, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to political apartheid. It reinforces the perception that members of the same racial group, regardless of their age, education, economic status, or the community in which they live, think alike, share the same political interests, and will prefer the same candidates at the polls. So redistricting is repugnant to the vision of the future in which race doesn't matter, except as a cosmetic difference in skin color. In 2000, in a case called Rice versus Cayetano, which is also a voting rights case, but about the right of Native Hawaiians to vote and not other people to vote in certain elections, Justice Kennedy said, one of the principal reasons race is treated as a forbidden classification is that it demeans the dignity and worth of a person to be judged by ancestry instead of by his or her own merit and essential qualities. An inquiry into ancestral lines is not consistent with respect based on the unique personality each of us possesses, a respect the Constitution itself secures in its concern for persons and citizens. And in Grutter in 2003, so this is the affirmative action case, Justice O'Connor famously declared that affirmative action and race-conscious remedies in general have to have a time limit. So she said the requirement that all race-conscious admissions programs have a termination point assures all citizens that the deviation from the norm of equal treatment of all racial and ethnic groups is a temporary matter, a measure taken in service of the goal of equality itself. It has been 25 years since Justice Powell first approved the use of race to further an interest in student body diversity. Since that time, the number of minority applicants with high grades and test scores has indeed increased. We expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interests approved today. And then finally in 2007, you've probably all heard this quote before, in Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District Number 1, Justice Roberts suggested that racial non-significance is a means in addition to an end, when he said that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. So this narrative that appears in the court's decision supposes that race has no content, it will just disappear eventually as the significant dividing lines between groups fall away. In the future, non-whites will be indistinguishable from whites in all ways except skin color. It's a story of assimilation. It's a story in which minority groups will come closer and closer to whiteness, and only skin-deep differences will remain, and those differences will be irrelevant. In some versions of this story, not usually in the court, but you see this in the media, they'll actually become physically indistinguishable as well. So there's this idea of the creation of this Creole mixed race identity that will eventually kind of supersede other racial identities. There is a New York Times article that, if I could track it down, I would show you the cover of it. It came out in the 90s or the early 2000s. And the article was about sort of the future of race, and the cover was all these pictures of ambiguously racial celebrities like Mariah Carey and Vin Diesel. And the suggestion is there will be this new majority that's composed of ambiguously racial people who are mixed, and race has become kind of a choice or a decoration for them. They can walk away from it when they need to. It's not a prison. So superdiversity doesn't undermine this story at all. It actually aligns perfectly with it. There was an earlier speaker told a story about the move from California to California from the South, where in the South, everyone has a racial identity, and in California, she didn't know the race of the people that she met. And I apologize for taking this. I don't mean to suggest that the speaker who said this actually has these ideas. But this echoes this idea about California and the mythology of California that ties into the legal goal of colorblindness and post-racialism. And the idea is that we're moving toward this future where race isn't going to matter, where we won't see it, and the differences don't matter, and actually race becomes fluid and undefined, where it's sort of a temporal progression from the South or even from the Northeast. So race was rigid and confining there, and it is just kind of decorative and voluntary here, if it exists at all. And we can see the assimilationist push of this story actually in the advocacy in civil rights cases as well that make it to the courts. So the focus in those cases is most often on ensuring access to white schools, white neighborhoods, professions that are predominantly white. The goal is sort of a collective move toward whiteness, or what whites have, either in the form of cultural and political assimilation, or, like I said, in the form of creating some kind of new identity. And the protections are individualized. So they're individualized because they're going toward a future where group doesn't matter anymore. And finally, you can actually see this in progressive critiques of what the court is doing. So we still, in a lot of meetings that I've been in, we're still talking about the measuring stick of a healthy community is centered on what whites are doing. So when we ask whether a minority community is doing well, we're asking whether the children have access to white schools often or are stuck in segregated ones. We're asking whether the families live in integrated neighborhoods or in ghettos. We compare statistics about wealth, educational attainment, and other indicators of powers to those of white communities. So Elise also talked about how the debate in the critique of what the court is doing, I think that you said the court is ignoring substantive equality and inclusion. So the critique is saying what the court is doing is not moving us towards substantive equality and inclusion, but it's still about inclusion. And Professor Kong explained that the contestation is often whether we have arrived at a colorblind future, but not really a contestation about whether the goal is to arrive at a colorblind future. So this isn't to say that all Black, Latino, and Asian people want nothing more than to assimilate and gain access to whiteness. I know that's what you're thinking that I'm saying. To have racial difference fade into nothing more than decorative differences. But the legal protections that are available now to minorities have been interpreted against this kind of assimilationist narrative, and as a result, it's difficult to conceptualize of minority rights that don't adhere to this story. So it's difficult to argue for something like an investment in Spanish language instruction, or separate schools for Black children, or the retention of an insular immigrant community, or strategic placement of adoptive children with families of the same race, or even the establishment of majority-minority voting districts. All of those seem at odds with this assimilationist model. But law offers another narrative about difference, and it is one that treats minority communities as groups with distinct cultural and political characteristics and seeks to preserve that difference. The place that we see this is in Indian law. So Indian people are protected by civil rights law just like everyone else, but the far more significant legal protections come from what is called federal Indian law. This is the body of legislation and case law that protects the rights of certain indigenous groups in the United States. And the goal of Indian law is to protect the rights of indigenous peoples as groups, and it's to protect their right to be different. So whereas race jurisprudence tends to embrace this integrationist, assimilationist ideal, and it looks to a future where race won't matter anymore, Indian law aims to ensure that difference will persist. And it does this by protecting the rights of Indian tribes as groups to be different from the rest of America. So how does it do this exactly? So Indians enjoy full US citizenship and civil rights. Today they do. But they're also members of separate political bodies. And as members of those separate political bodies, they can maintain separate schools. They can control the placement of Indian foster youth with Indian families. They can operate their own justice systems. They can base those justice systems on principles of restitution and recovery, for example, instead of individualized punishment. They can have tribal governments that are based on religious and kinship structures rather than a separation between church and state. Tribes can, like I said, they run their own schools, they instruct in their own languages in those schools, they can control their own lands. There's all these rights that are tied to the rights of Indian tribes as groups that allow tribes to maintain something that is different from what white Americans are doing. So the conversation about where these rights are going and the struggle for these rights doesn't even have to be about getting to whiteness because the goal is different. And so even a cursory survey of Indian law cases demonstrates how critical these political rights have been for tribes. They've far surpassed, I would argue, US citizenship and civil rights in terms of their role in counteracting the forced disappearance of Indians and improving the lives of Indian people. So one lesson we can draw from Indian law is that group political rights can be important tools for communities of color to resist racism. But no other community of color in the US can legally exercise these types of political and governmental powers. And indeed, most minority groups encounter significant resistance when they even begin to articulate a group political identity, let alone exert a claim like nationhood or geographic separateness or political autonomy. So Indian law is unique in this way, and I think that it provides a good lesson for how to think about other things that law can do. The other thing about Indian law is that these group rights are clearly linked to an effort to preserve separateness as opposed to assimilation. So this is because the history of Indian law involves several periods of explicit forced assimilation. So while other groups were being kept out of American citizenship in the civic and the figurative sense, so American identity and citizenship rights, Indians were actually kind of being eaten by it. In the late 1800s, individual Indian people were granted U.S. citizenship in these ceremonies in which they renounced Indian cultural practices and adopted white cultural practices. They adopted white names. They had to promise to sort of act white in the future in order to be citizens. Indian children were sent to federal boarding schools where they were taught how to act white, and the architect of those schools said that it was necessary to kill the Indian in order to save the man. And before and after that period, some laws defined Indian people as Indian only if they possessed a certain degree of Indian blood. So you have to be half or a quarter Indian in order to be legally Indian. So federal policy sought to eradicate Indians through forced cultural and physical disappearance at different times. This policy of forced assimilation was later rejected. As an official matter, we can argue about whether it's actually gone. And so Indian law today is actually mindful of that history. And tribes exercising their rights as political entities, they've been able to resist and counteract these federal efforts to eradicate them. So they have very specific rights that enable them to do this. For example, they can counter forced disappearance of Indian people by redefining membership rules to do away with restrictive blood quantum requirements. That protects against Indian people disappearing in a physical sense. They can take steps to protect natural resources and spur economic development and ensure public safety in Indian communities, thereby countering their disappearance in a geographic sense. And they can run schools, they can run justice systems and social service programs in a manner that reflects and protects Indian languages, Indian religions, cultural traditions, and thereby protects against their disappearance in a cultural sense. So they can stay there and they can stay different, and that's what's important about Indian law. So this anti-assimilationist drive is made possible because Indian law grows directly out of a history of colonization, and the courts, to some degree, recognize it. Set against a story of empire and colonization as opposed to a story of immigration and integration, Indian law can look at things differently. In the story behind Indian law, the U.S. has expanded on top of people of color. The U.S. sat down on top of Indians. And contrast this with the story that dominates other areas of law in which people of color willingly came to the U.S., or in the case of the narrative around African Americans, the people didn't willingly come, but the story starts when they affirmatively started to seek integration into the political community rather than starting with their forcible denaturalization from Africa. So it might seem like an odd exercise to generalize concepts from Indian law. I can see the Indian law people getting ready to ask questions about, actually it's really different, why are you doing this? Indian law is frequently described as sui generis. It is different, it's alone, it doesn't look like anything else. Indigenous people, or at least people who are enrolled in federally recognized tribes, have a special legal status, and there are a lot of kind of legal reasons why this status might be different. So chief among those is that indigenous people have claims to land and self-governance that predate the Constitution. They were treated as separate nations in early US law, and they entered into treaties, which other groups didn't do. So there are lots of legal bases for why Indian rights should look different. Their history is also, like I said, in many ways opposite. It included forced inclusion instead of exclusion, colonization instead of immigration, diverse political and cultural groups collapsing into a single group called Indians, so the backward version of superdiversity. And this can make it hard to talk about Indian law and other minorities on the same panel. But looking squarely at the way that Indian law protects Indian rights helps illuminate a different way of thinking about how law can protect and advance the interests of minority groups and what the goal of those legal protections should be. I'll say one more thing because I know I'm out of time. Many people have noted that Indians are often invisible or unacknowledged when we talk about race. They were largely invisible in the discussion of history. In the first panel, I think there were a couple mentions of indigenous people. And in law, some of the rights of indigenous people are actually protected, but they're protected by dividing the discussion. So the discussion of Indians is divided from the discussion of race and racial minorities. Indian tribes, in other words, have better luck protecting their rights when they don't say that it's about race. And there are two obvious costs to this division. One is that it's more difficult for Native people to link their particular grievances and concerns, so things like jurisdiction and land rights and economic development, to a discussion of race and racism. And a second cost is that it's more difficult for other groups to advance struggles for group identity and separateness because they are cabined by a limited vision of anti-racism in civil rights law, and they don't have access to the kinds of protections that Indian law has. So my hope is that by talking about the conceptual underpinnings of Indian law at a race conference, we can think a little bit beyond this binary. To paraphrase Owen Fiss, the individualized integrationist model that strives toward a colorblind future that we see in civil rights law is not actually embedded in the text of the Equal Protection Clause. It's just a mediating principle. It was developed and applied by the courts as they have interpreted what equality means. And to point you in one possible new direction, in American law, Indian rights have been excised from an equality analysis by the argument that they're political and not racial, so we don't really talk about equality when we talk about Indians. But in international indigenous rights, there's been more of a move to interpret the word equality differently so that it's not incompatible with group rights. And that's a place where we might look to start to think about different interpretations in US law. So, thank you.
First of all, thank you, Devin, for inviting me and the other organizers of the conference. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take literally the challenge that was asked of us on this panel to talk about the limitations of a law with respect to particular issues related to immigrants. And it's, of course, important to acknowledge, and it came out in the first couple panels this morning, that most of today's so-called superdiversity, or a lot of diversity, is as a result of immigration and immigrants. And so I think it's kind of ironic that because of that diversity, in spite of that diversity rather, that really when it comes to immigration policy, immigrants are in a lot of trouble when it comes to believing that going to court might be a remedy. So, for example, every day there's somebody that dies at the border. I'm exaggerating only a little bit now. That was more true about 3 years ago, but still, there's about 400 deaths per year at the border, and it's as a result of Operation Gatekeeper and its extension along the border, which I won't get into the details, but it's an intentional enforcement effort that militarizes the border, that began with Bill Clinton and has continued through the Fence Act and Obama, that pushes people to traverse the border at the most dangerous parts. And everybody knows that there's going to be a death as a result. And so it's willful and knowing on our part, on the government's part, that occurs. Furthermore, there's 30,000 people in any given day that are in detention, in ICE detention facilities. There was a big deal made out of the fact that a few hundred were released this week because of sequester. But the truth is there's still 30,000 people in custody in any given day. We also know that the president, on the president's watch, the Obama and Napolitano administration have set a record of deportations. 400,000 people were deported last year, far more than in any given term as any of his predecessors, at a cost, incidentally, of about several $1 billion a year, and the detentions alone are about $113,000 a day. So, in addition to these things that occur that largely have racial impact, the raids, and today Obama doesn't at least do the gun-toting raids of the Bush administration, but every day he engages in silent raids where it's immigrants that lose work, thousands of immigrants a day who are asked to leave their work because their Social Security numbers don't match. And things that aren't listed up here, for example, that have extremely racial impact, particularly visited upon Asians and Latinos, are the backlogs in immigration categories. So that somebody who wants to immigrate in certain family immigration categories from Mexico or the Philippines or the Dominican Republic or India stand to wait in some periods for up to 20 years, believe it or not, in some immigration categories. Another example of something that's not listed up there is in 1996, Congress, on a bill that was signed off by President Clinton, conveniently put in the act that if you are undocumented and you for more than a year and you step out of the country for a day, you're barred from returning for 10 years, even if you fall into an immigration category. That 10-year bar is visited primarily upon Latinos, because the reason why you would have to leave the country in order to re-immigrate is because you're not qualified under the law to adjust your status here in the United States without getting into much difficult detail. So the 10-year bar really only applies primarily to Mexicans. It doesn't apply to an overstayed student or an overstayed visitor. It applies to somebody who entered without inspection. Why is it that we accept these issues, these phenomena, these enforcement policies, and these immigration laws as awful enough things, but we don't define them or discuss them in terms of the racial impact? And that's partly what I want to try to get to today. So there's two basic reasons why this has occurred. This being that we tend to accept what has occurred in non-racial terms. One reason is Congress's so-called plenary power to act in the immigration area. And historically, we're all familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Acts and how, in spite of the fact that there was specific language that was aimed at Chinese laborers, the Supreme Court upheld the power of Congress to basically do whatever it wants to in very deferential appraisal by the court because of a naturalization clause in the Constitution and because of foreign policy strengths and powers that the federal government has. In 1870, when citizenship was extended, the right to apply for naturalization for citizenship was extended to people of African heritage, there was a specific effort to try to get Chinese and other Asians to be able to be naturalized as well, but they were specifically excluded. And so ingenious challenges were raised by Ozawa and Thin, who was a South Asian, that, well, we should be able to apply because we're actually white. And they were unsuccessful. They were unsuccessful because the Supreme Court said, you may not be Chinese, but we know you ain't white. And so the answer is no, you're not eligible because Congress has the power to act in naturalization. One thing that I could insert between those naturalization cases that were in the 1920s and Japanese internment, which of course was in the 1940s, is the national origins quota system, which was directed at Southern and Eastern European immigrants that we were unhappy with. We became very unhappy with them in the early 1900s. So we decided to reformulate the immigration laws in a manner that we took the perfect demographic makeup of the country. And that perfect demographic makeup of the country was 1890, okay? And so that's the formula under which the national origins quota system was. So if 90% of the United States in 1870, 1890 was Western European, that was the percentage of new immigrants that should be allowed in after the 1920 quota systems. And of course, those were upheld. Japanese internment, of course, is upheld even though the vast majority of Japanese that were interned were U.S. citizens. They were suspect for being spies or for being what today we would call national security problems, and back then the argument was that there was a military necessity, which later, of course, was debunked. But again, relatively deferential, other people might disagree with me, but relatively deferential view of what happened to Japanese during that time. In 1979, we've all seen Argo of late. What you didn't realize that what was happening in the United States is that George Bush and his Attorney General ordered that every Iranian F1 student, foreign student in the United States, come to INS. We want to see you. And so if you look at, and that was all upheld, there was a lot of litigation on Iranian students' behalf, but that power was upheld. And if you look at reported cases, Court of Appeals cases, during that time that deal with asylum and deportation of students, they're all Iranian names and they all lost. And then, of course, after 9/11, there's a focus on enforcement aimed at Mensa groups and the Alien Absconder Initiative, 314,000 individuals were targeted. Several thousand of those were from countries that, quote unquote, might have Al-Qaeda connections. And the special registration program involved 25 Muslim countries. Everyone on a non-immigrant visa from one of those Muslim countries was ordered to come into, it was still INS at that time, very similar to the Iranian student situation. 83,000 of those individuals came into immigration offices, and 13,000 of them were deported. So that plenary power is what enables the Congress to do what it wants to. So back to this question, and the other part of why this is permitted is because of what I believe has become institutionalized racism. And Mexican migration is, so let me explain what has happened. In my opinion, what has happened is that based on history and enforcement, we've developed a mindset and a language that not only commodifies immigrants, but also brands them illegal, or brands them undocumented, or brands them undocumented, rather than brands them even an undocumented Mexican, or an overstayed Korean, or somebody who's entered without inspection from Latin America. It's all about being classified as an undocumented person, or somebody who's deportable, or somebody who would be a would-be immigrant to the United States. And so, so that between 1848 and 1960, there actually was unrestricted Mexican migration to the United States. Now, there were some requirements, but until 1965, which 1965 incidentally represents a major moving point for Asian immigrants, because 1965, the theory is that the vestiges of the Asian exclusion laws were removed at that time, and it allowed Asians to immigrate to the United States. But, and I want to come back to that in a minute, but what never gets discussed is the fact that for the first time, there were numerical limitations placed on Mexicans in 1965. So they were lumped into a Western Hemisphere quota of 120,000 for the first time. Then, in 1976, they were told, well, we're going to treat you like the rest of the world, Mexico was told. Not only do you don't get to share 120,000 visas because you're getting about 46,000 of those each year. Now you must only get 20,000 visas per year. So immediately, Mexican immigration, legal Mexican immigration, is restrained severely between 1965 and 1976. All the time, there being recruitment of Mexican workers to the United States and the secular seasonal movement of Mexican workers to the United States. In 1986, IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control, for the first time, employer sanctions is made part of the law. So prior to 1986, it was okay for an employer to hire an undocumented worker. It was after 1986 that it becomes undocumented, that it becomes unlawful for an employer. So that's a pivotal moment, because employer sanctions is what authorizes raids. It's what authorizes Obama to engage in silent raids. It's in the name of employer sanctions, this unfounded theory that if we deport people or stop them from working, that it's going to free up jobs for available U.S. workers. The Asian exclusion era has a long and sordid history. It isn't until World War II that it begins to be corrected. But the point is that between the 1800s and 1965, the development of the Asian American community was completely shut down. You could only do it through natural births. There's a reason why in 1970 the largest Asian American group was Japanese Americans, because they had negotiated in 1907 that they could bring their wives. The farmers could bring their wives. No other Asian group was able to do that. So Japanese Americans grew naturally. The other groups were not able to do that. So when the 1965 Immigration Act comes about, it's wonderful in the sense that people get to start coming from those countries, but year after year, because of the 20,000 numerical limitation, slowly but surely a backlog develops, because the system that was in place was one of per country numerical limitations, and it doesn't accommodate for countries with big visa demands for whatever reasons, political reasons, economic reasons. And so where that gets us is that we get to the structure that when you stand back, you realize that what's happened is that by creating a system where there aren't enough visas available, continuing to recruit workers to come to the United States, particularly across the southern border, we give certain numbers of visas available to country, but it doesn't accommodate for backlogs and big visa demand. We then begin to label those individuals as who come across illegally or overstay their visas as undocumented or illegal. They're not labeled in conjunction with their particular ethnic or racial group. So that as we do that, we dehumanize them and we begin to be able to label them as a deportable group, not as Mexicans who were controlled by NAFTA or the World Trade Organization agreement, not as somebody who came here because of war or conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq, but simply somebody who figures out how to get here and then becomes undocumented. So we label them as problematic because they're taking away jobs, because they don't speak English, whatever, all the right-wing rhetoric that's directed at immigrants. And so by labeling them in those negative terms, we then dehumanize them, and then we can criminalize them, because after all, they've broken the law by overstaying their visa. After all, they've broken the law by crossing the border illegally. And our enforcement efforts aren't about deporting a Mexican or putting an overstayed person in jail who's worked without authorization in detention, an overstayed Korean or overstayed person from the Philippines. We are detaining somebody who's undocumented. We're deporting somebody who's illegal because we've treated them and commodified them in a manner that we no longer look at them in terms of racial terms, at least from the mainstream. So that when people die at the border, we don't see headlines about individuals dying at the border. If we see headlines, we see headlines about bodies that are found, but they're not identified. And we might feel sorry for them, but we're not curious enough to find out why they came. We're only curious enough to wonder why they didn't go to the post office and apply for a visa, which is insane, of course. So, I was curious when Angela introduced the panel, and she celebrated, as I do, yesterday's signing of VAWA, and she declared that as a victory for law. It is a victory for law, and when I get to that point with immigration policy, yeah, I declare that as a victory for law, but what underlies that statement and what I just said is that the law helps when social change has given rise to that legal change legislatively. But in terms of litigation, we're in deep trouble because of the types of things that the previous speakers have alluded to. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Those were excellent presentations. Since we're running a little bit behind and we want to stay moderately on track, because I know some people are actually flying out this evening, what I suggest is that I'd like to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, get the questions queued up, and then give each of our panelists a couple of minutes to respond to any of those questions of their choosing, or even to give final thoughts. So could we begin and get 2 or 3 questions on the table? I think there's one right up here at the front.
I know in law in tort law, there's where there's a right and there's a remedy. And seeing that you all had sort of outlined different rights, different remedies, and sometimes in conflict, so I just wanted to speak to that, sort of the difference between sort of the Indian law or affirmative action, what is the right and what's the remedy.
Great. And let's take one more and then give our panelists a chance to make final comments. Is there another question?
Hi, my question is there a plausible way to keep our politicians accountable to the promises that they make? Because I think for me, one of my main critiques of Obama is that he began with this wonderful democratic rhetoric, but he's faltered over the years, for instance, with mass deportation. So that's just my question. Is there a plausible way to keep them accountable? And that's open to any of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, how about we go in reverse order and start with Professor Hing and give everyone a chance to respond in whatever way you see fit.
Thanks. Well, let me address that particular question. Obviously, I don't know what all your political persuasions are, but people have been trying to put a lot of pressure on him with respect to immigration policy in particular. It's in the news every day now. And the Dreamers did a magnificent job. And there's even division within the immigrant rights community over what types of reform are needed. And you know, every day I'm on the phone to somebody in DC who's working on language in one of the different subcommittees or at the White House. And they're getting bombarded with everything. But the direct answer to your question, and he said it himself to us, that he wants to be told, he wants to hear, and he actually has opened the door to comments and criticism, but we shall see, because he also will not listen to us when it comes to criticism of secure communities, for example, or criticisms of the detention policies, or criticism of militarization of the border, because his claim is that he still needs to have credibility with the right. He's a horrible negotiator. You know, one of the classes I teach is negotiation. He's one of the world's worst negotiators, because he knows that the Republicans keep moving the goalpost on him. He says that over and over, but he continues to engage them. And it's frustrating for all of us.
Thank you.
So I want to address first the right and remedy question. So my answer is no. I don't actually think in law where there's a right, there's a remedy. Two examples. So in the context of race and civil rights law, we might talk about rights to equality. And then when you go down the road of sort of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, you end up at the place that Jerry was talking about, where you look at two people or two groups that the outcomes are very different, and the idea that equality is a right that they have, well, it doesn't matter, because the interpretation is that we're in a merit-based competition, and it must be their fault if it came out unequal. So in that sense, there's no remedy under law for the inequality that you end up with. And in the context of Indian law, just so you don't think that I'm suggesting that Indian law is all the way great, there's Indians don't ever get their land back. So there's a number of cases in Indian law in which it's recognized that land was taken illegally. They can get money, but if the tribes refuse to take the money, they can't have the land. So that's, to me, a right without a remedy. You might say money is the remedy, but it's not satisfactory to the tribes. And I won't say much about the question about how to keep Obama accountable, except to say two things. First of all, I was a lobbyist in my former life, and all I can say is change happens really slowly. And the other is, and this is so basic, but it's something that Kimberly Crenshaw said a number of years ago at another conference. It's important for the left to keep making the critiques that the left is making while the right is making the critiques that the right is making, because otherwise there's no one urging Obama to move further to the left. So that's pretty basic, but it's the only answer I have.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I was really struck by the tort law framework. And no, I don't. I agree with Addie that where there's a right, there isn't necessarily a remedy, and Brown versus Board of Education is a classic example of that, where there was a finding of intentional discrimination and no meaningful remedy for that. And you know, here I guess it's interesting, because I'm going to flip the script a little bit on what I said before, and that is that you know, as civil rights lawyers have tried to resist the individualized framework that is the premise of your question, right? Which is that we want to sort of train the substantive goals through a lens of kind of naked individualism. And I actually, out of your presentation, really spoke to me on that in that regard, right? That is that we want to look more substantively to notions of group equality. The problem is that constitutional doctrine has inhibited us in that regard, as I was discussing in Bakke. And so, where do we go from there is a really huge question, and whether we can actually accomplish it through law is a really huge question. The question of political accountability. I think one of the things that has struck me in then again, I have to be a little bit careful, but in the role that I've been in the last year and a half, we've done a lot of work with the Obama administration, and I'm struck that there's something about institutions that change people, and the executive branch, that sort of once perhaps you become president of the United States, that the orientation changes. But the other piece of this, though, is that there is an enormous amount of power that resides within the administrative agencies, and I've been totally fascinated by the way in which people who occupy spaces within administrative agencies are able to sort of frustrate change at a really granular level in ways that sort of fly below the radar. And I'll leave it at that.
Very quickly, 2 points. One on the arrogance of the test makers or the scientists. I think actually the principal message is just the opposite. Majid Banaji and Tony Greenwald have taken these IITs. They admit that they, quote, show the biases that they thought they would never have. And the message is instead one of humility, that we're not as good as we think we are. And that starts the conversation, not to end it. The second point about rights and remedies, all that I want to emphasize is that, look, I don't mean to suggest that science actually is sufficient to drive anything like social change. I think we all have different theories about legal change and social movements, but oftentimes science gives judges a hook on which they could actually put their hat. So in Brown versus Board of Education, when they say whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, the finding of harm to black children is amply supported by modern authority, they pivot. Not because they, I think, are actually persuaded by the doll studies of the Clarks, because they think the time is now to change, but judges can't just state change. They have to say something different has happened. We've learned something new, therefore we can make the pivot. And I'm trying to suggest that the science used well by the left and by scientists and by lawyers could actually create the little elbow room that we might be able to find to allow for possibilities of change when that fifth justice, whether it be Kennedy or someone else, decides that there's a little pivot to be made. We need to keep creating that elbow room, and that's what I think the intriguing new science makes potentially possible.
Wonderful, thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists. And since we're running a bit behind, instead of a 15-minute break, can we try to take a 6-minute break and come back as soon as possible to begin the next panel? Thank you.